Before the pyramids had claimed their final form against the Egyptian sky. Before the great empires of the ancient world had written their names across the face of history in stone and conquest and blood. Before any of the extraordinary events that would define the story of Israel as a nation had begun to unfold, there was a family. A deeply complicated, painfully human, divinely chosen family living in the land of Canaan. And within that family, there was a boy. A boy who dreamed dreams that no one around him was ready to hear. A boy whose father loved him with a love so visible and so particular that it poisoned the air between him and his brothers until that poison produced something so dark, so irreversible, so devastating in its immediate human reality that it would take decades and the sovereign hand of God himself to redeem it into something beautiful. His name was Joseph. And his story, from the coat his father gave him to the throne of Egypt, from the pit his brothers threw him into to the palace where he would one day hold the fate of nations in his hands, is perhaps the most complete, the most psychologically rich, the most theologically profound narrative in the entire book of Genesis. It is a story about family and betrayal and suffering and faithfulness and the extraordinary, counterintuitive, never giving up sovereignty of a God who works in the darkness as confidently as he works in the light. Who uses the worst things human beings do to each other as the very instrument through which his purposes are accomplished. Who takes the pit and the prison and the false accusation and the forgotten promise and the years of silence and weaves them, without violating a single human choice along the way, into a tapestry of redemption that leaves the observer breathless. Jacob was the father. The patriarch whose name God had changed to Israel after a night of wrestling with the divine at the ford of the Jabbok. Genesis 32 verse 28, a man who had himself known something of betrayal and exile and the long painful journey of a life shaped by both human failure and divine faithfulness. Jacob had 12 sons, born to 4 different women across the complicated marital history that the patriarchal narratives record with characteristic honesty. And among those 12 sons, one occupied a place in Jacob's heart that was different in kind from the place the others occupied. Joseph. The son of Rachel. The son of the woman Jacob had loved first and longest and most completely, the woman whose death in childbirth giving birth to Joseph's younger brother Benjamin had left a wound in Jacob that never fully healed. Genesis 35 verses 18 to 19, Joseph was the son of that love and that grief combined. And Jacob loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age. Genesis 37 verse 3. He made him a robe. The famous robe, described in the Hebrew text with a phrase that has been translated in various ways across the centuries of biblical scholarship, a robe of many colors in some traditions, a long robe with sleeves in others, but in every translation communicating the same essential reality, a garment that set Joseph apart, that marked him as specially favored, that made visible to every eye in the camp the particular love his father bore him. Genesis 37 verse 3, it was a gift of love. And it was, in the dynamics of a family already complicated by the tensions of multiple mothers and competing inheritances and the accumulated resentments of brothers who had grown up watching their father's heart belong most fully to one woman and her son, it was a declaration of war. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Genesis 37 verse 4, could not speak peacefully to him. The hatred was so complete, so settled, so thoroughly established in their hearts that ordinary civil conversation had become impossible. The sight of Joseph, the sound of his voice, the presence of that robe, all of it was a constant, daily, inescapable reminder of what they did not have and what he did. And into this already volatile family situation, Joseph began to dream. He dreamed the first dream and told his brothers. We were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. Genesis 37 verses 6 to 7, his brothers heard the dream and the hatred that was already fully formed in their hearts found new fuel. Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? Genesis 37 verse 8, the question contained within it every accumulated grievance, every year of watching their father's favoritism, every moment of feeling diminished by the presence of the beloved son. And Joseph dreamed again. The sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Genesis 37 verse 9, this time even Jacob rebuked him. Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? Genesis 37 verse 10, but while his brothers were jealous of him, his father kept the saying in mind. Genesis 37 verse 11. Kept the saying in mind. Jacob had rebuked the dream publicly, but privately he had not dismissed it. Because Jacob was a man who knew something about divine dreams and divine promises that seem impossible in the present moment. He was the grandson of Abraham, to whom God had promised that his offspring would be as the stars of heaven. He was the son of Isaac, over whom the same promises had been reaffirmed. He was himself the man who had seen the vision of the ladder reaching from earth to heaven at Bethel, and had heard the voice of God at the top of it reaffirming the covenant. Genesis 28 verses 12 to 15, he knew that God spoke through dreams. He knew that what seemed impossible from a human perspective was not impossible from a divine one. And so while the brothers burned with jealousy and the family tension drew tighter with every passing day, Jacob watched and waited and kept the saying in mind. The moment of catastrophe, when it came, did not announce itself as catastrophe. It came dressed as an ordinary errand. Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who were pasturing the flocks near Shechem, to see if it was well with the brothers and well with the flocks, and to bring word back. Genesis 37 verse 14, a father sending a son. A routine act of familial communication in a pastoral world. Joseph set out from the valley of Hebron. He did not know what was waiting for him. He could not have known. He was 17 years old, wearing his father's gift on his shoulders, walking toward his brothers in the innocence of an ordinary errand, carrying his father's care in one hand and the remembered images of his extraordinary dreams in the other. His brothers saw him from a distance. And before he came near to them they conspired against him to kill him. Genesis 37 verse 18, they said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. Genesis 37 verses 19 to 20, here comes this dreamer. The contempt in those words is total. The deliberate murder they were planning was not an act of passion but of calculation, a conspiracy formed in the time it took a 17-year-old boy to walk from the distance where they first spotted him to the place where they were sitting. They had time to plan. They chose to plan. And what they planned was the death of their own brother. But Reuben, the eldest, heard it and rescued him out of their hands, saying, let us not take his life. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him. Genesis 37 verses 21 to 22, Reuben intended to come back and rescue Joseph and return him to his father. His intervention saved Joseph's life in the immediate moment. But it did not save him from what came next. They stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Genesis 37 verses 23 to 24, and then they sat down to eat bread. They sat down to eat bread. Joseph was in the pit. 17 years old. His brother's voices audible above him. The robe his father had given him stripped from his back. The ordinary daylight continuing above the darkness of the pit as if nothing of consequence had happened. And his brothers sat down to eat. The detail is not incidental. It is a portrait of how completely the hatred had cauterized whatever remained of their brotherly feeling, that they could throw a teenage boy into a pit and sit down to a meal within earshot of him. The distance between what they were doing and what love required was not merely a moral distance. It was a distance that had been traveled step by step across years of accumulated resentment, and they had arrived at this terrible place without apparently feeling the full weight of where they had arrived. And then, as they were eating, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Genesis 37 verse 25, Egypt. The great civilization on the Nile. The most powerful, most sophisticated, most enduring empire of the ancient world. The caravan heading toward it with its cargo of spices and resins was a completely ordinary commercial expedition, traders moving goods along the ancient trade routes that connected Canaan to Egypt across the Sinai. And Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." Genesis 37 verses 26 to 27. Our brother, our own flesh. Even in the act of selling him, even in the reduction of their brother to a commercial transaction, Judah appealed to the biological reality of what they shared. And his brothers listened to him. They lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. Genesis 37 verse 28, 20 pieces of silver. The price of a 17-year-old boy. The price at which his brothers valued the life of the son of their father's heart. 20 pieces of silver, and a caravan heading toward Egypt, and a boy who had walked out that morning on an ordinary errand and would never see his father's face again for 22 years. And Reuben returned to the pit, and Joseph was not in the pit. He tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and I, where shall I go?" Genesis 37 verses 29 to 30, where shall I go? The anguish of a man who had intended to do right and had come back too late. The brothers took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." Genesis 37 verses 31 to 32, please identify whether it is your son's robe or not. The cruelty of those words, making the father himself pronounce the verdict, making Jacob's own recognition of the robe the instrument of his destruction, is breathtaking in its coldness. And Jacob identified it and said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Genesis 37 verses 33 to 35, thus his father wept for him. The man who had sent his son on an errand that morning wept for him as dead. Refused comfort. Declared that he would mourn until his own death. The love that had given Joseph the robe now became the instrument of Jacob's most prolonged and most devastating grief. And the brothers who had caused it stood by and watched and said nothing. Meanwhile, and that word, meanwhile, carries within it the entire sovereign movement of God working in the background of human events that appear to be nothing but chaos and cruelty. Joseph had been brought down to Egypt. And Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. Genesis 37 verse 36, bought him. Joseph, the beloved son of Jacob, the dreamer of extraordinary dreams, the boy in the coat of many colors, was now a slave in Egypt. Purchased. Owned. Completely subject to the will of another human being who had acquired him as a commercial transaction on the slave market of the ancient world. The pit had been the end of everything Joseph had known. The caravan to Egypt had been the beginning of everything God was about to do. And the God who had given Joseph the dreams was already at work, in the darkness, in the silence, in the apparently God-forsaken space between the pit and the palace, doing what he had always been doing, what he would always do, what no human betrayal or human cruelty or human failure could ultimately prevent him from doing. Egypt. The word itself carried weight in the ancient world that no modern description can fully capture. Egypt was not merely a nation or a geographic location. It was a civilization, the most ancient, the most sophisticated, the most enduring human civilization that the ancient Near East had produced. The pyramids of Giza, already ancient by the time Joseph arrived, stood as monuments to a culture that had been organizing human labor and human knowledge and human religious imagination on a scale that the rest of the ancient world could only observe with a mixture of awe and incomprehension. The Nile, that extraordinary river whose annual flooding deposited the rich black silt that made the Nile Valley the most fertile agricultural land in the known world, was the economic and spiritual heartbeat of the entire civilization. Egypt was wealthy, organized, powerful, and ancient in a way that communicated permanence and inevitability. To arrive in Egypt as a slave was to arrive at the bottom of the most stratified and hierarchical society in the ancient world. And Joseph arrived at the bottom. Purchased from Ishmaelite traders by a man named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, a man of significant power and position in the Egyptian military and administrative hierarchy. Genesis 37 verse 36, Joseph was now a household slave. The son of the patriarch Jacob, the boy who had dreamed of sheaves bowing and stars falling at his feet, was now the property of an Egyptian official, assigned to whatever domestic and administrative tasks his new master required. The distance between where he had started and where he had arrived, between the beloved son in the coat of many colors in Canaan and the purchased slave in an Egyptian household, was not merely geographical. It was a distance that would have crushed the spirit of most human beings. That would have produced bitterness so total and so justified that no reasonable observer could have blamed him for it. But something happened in Potiphar's house that Scripture records with a simplicity that is more powerful than any elaborate description could be. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. Genesis 39 verses 2-3, the Lord was with Joseph. In Egypt. In slavery. In the household of a foreign official who worshipped foreign gods. In the place that was, from every external perspective, the furthest possible point from the promises and the blessings and the covenant relationship that his grandfather Abraham and his father Jacob had known. The Lord was with Joseph there. Not only in Canaan. Not only in the tent of his father. Not only when he was the beloved son in the favored coat. In Egypt. In slavery. In the darkness and the displacement and the complete absence of everything that had previously defined his life. God was there. And Potiphar noticed. He saw that the Lord was with him. He saw that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed. The divine blessing on Joseph's life was not invisible, it expressed itself in the visible, practical, measurable reality of everything Joseph touched succeeding. Work given to Joseph was done better than work given to anyone else. Problems assigned to Joseph were solved with greater clarity and efficiency. The household under Joseph's management ran with a quality of organization and effectiveness that communicated something beyond ordinary human competence. Potiphar was an Egyptian official with no covenant relationship with the God of Israel, and yet he saw the evidence of that God's presence in the work of his Hebrew slave with enough clarity to respond to it. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. Genesis 39 verse 4. From slave to overseer. From purchased property to the man in charge of everything. The elevation was not gradual and unnoticed, it was deliberate and complete. Potiphar put all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Genesis 39 verses 5-6, no concern about anything. The man who owned Joseph trusted him so completely, had experienced the results of that trust so thoroughly and so consistently, that he had effectively stepped back from the management of his own household and his own fields and placed everything in Joseph's hands. It was an extraordinary position for a slave. It was the kind of trust that could only be built through consistent, demonstrated, unimpeachable integrity over time. And Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. Genesis 39 verse 6, Scripture inserts this detail here, not at the beginning of Joseph's story but at this specific moment, because it is about to become directly relevant to what happens next. Joseph had arrived at a position of trust and responsibility and relative comfort within the constraints of his slavery. The divine blessing was visible in everything he did. His master trusted him completely. And then his master's wife looked at him. And after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." Genesis 39 verse 7, the directness of the proposition, the complete absence of subtlety or pretense, communicates the confidence of a woman accustomed to having what she wanted. She was the wife of a powerful man in a society where power was absolute. She wanted Joseph. And she said so. But he refused. Genesis 39 verse 8, 2 words. Among the most significant 2 words in the entire narrative of Joseph's life. Not, he hesitated and then refused. Not, he was tempted and struggled and eventually refused. He refused. With a clarity and a decisiveness that communicate a man whose moral commitments were not subject to negotiation regardless of the circumstances. And then he explained why. "Behold, because of me my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, and he has kept back nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Genesis 39 verses 8 to 9. Sin against God. Not merely a violation of his master's trust, though he named that too. Not merely a betrayal of the relationship that had elevated him from slave to overseer. Sin against God. Joseph's refusal was ultimately grounded not in pragmatic calculation or professional loyalty but in theological reality. He understood his life as lived before God. He understood his actions as having a vertical dimension, not merely answerable to Potiphar or to Egyptian social convention but to the God who was with him, whose presence he had experienced in the midst of his slavery, whose blessing had been the explanation for everything that had gone right in this foreign household. To commit this act would be to sin against that God. And that, for Joseph, settled the question. She did not accept the refusal. And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her or to be with her. Genesis 39 verse 10, day after day. The persistence of the proposition was not a one-time encounter that Joseph navigated with a single decision. It was a sustained, daily, relentless pressure, the repeated, deliberate approach of a woman who was accustomed to getting what she wanted and who had apparently decided that Joseph's initial refusal was an obstacle to be overcome rather than a boundary to be respected. And day after day, Joseph refused. Not once and then weakened. Not in the first week and then compromised. Day after day, in the face of daily pressure, in a situation where compliance would have been easy and the consequences of refusal were unknown, he refused. Until the day when he went into the house to do his work and none of the men of the house was there in the house. She caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. Genesis 39 verses 11 to 12, he fled. He left the garment, his clothing, his dignity, his property, in her hand and ran. The flight was not cowardice. It was the practical wisdom of a man who understood that some situations require not argument but exit. He had argued. He had refused. He had explained. And now, in the moment of physical confrontation with no witnesses and no restraint available except his own, he ran. And in her hand was the garment he had left behind. And she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house." Genesis 39 verses 13 to 15, the lie was immediate and complete and constructed with the garment as its evidence. The same kind of false evidence that had been used against Joseph before, a garment presented as proof of something that had not happened, used to construct a narrative that served the presenter's purposes at the complete expense of the truth. His brothers had used his coat dipped in goat's blood. Potiphar's wife used the garment he had left in her hand in flight. Twice, in Joseph's story, a garment had been turned against him. Twice, physical evidence had been manipulated to tell a lie about him to someone with power over his fate. And when his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. Genesis 39 verses 19 to 20, Prison. From the pit to the slave market to Potiphar's house to the overseer's position to the prison. The trajectory of Joseph's life, viewed from the outside, from the perspective of any observer without knowledge of what God was doing beneath the surface of these events, looked like an unbroken sequence of injustice and loss. He had done everything right. He had served faithfully. He had refused the temptation at enormous personal cost. He had fled when flight was the only remaining option. And the consequence of his integrity was a prison cell. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Genesis 39 verse 21, But the Lord was with Joseph. The same sentence that had appeared at the beginning of his time in Potiphar's house now appeared at the beginning of his time in prison. The same divine presence. The same steadfast love. In the pit, God was present. In Potiphar's house, God was present. In the prison, God was present. The location changed. The circumstances changed. The depth of the injustice intensified with each new development. But the presence of God did not change. The steadfast love of God did not waver. The purposes of God were not derailed by Potiphar's wife's lie or by Potiphar's anger or by the prison cell that resulted from both. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. Genesis 39 verses 22 to 23, Overseer of Potiphar's house. Now overseer of the prison. The pattern was repeating itself with the same consistency and the same divine signature. Wherever Joseph was placed, however unjust the circumstances that placed him there, God's presence expressed itself through the same visible, practical, undeniable reality of everything Joseph touched succeeding. His gifts did not diminish in the prison. His integrity did not collapse under the weight of injustice. His relationship with God did not wither in the darkness of a prison cell. He continued to be, in the prison, exactly who he had been in Potiphar's house, faithful, competent, trustworthy, marked by the unmistakable blessing of God. And in that prison, God was setting the stage for the next act of a story that was moving, with the steady and unhurried confidence of divine sovereignty, exactly where God had always intended it to go. The prison where Joseph was confined was not an ordinary holding facility. Scripture describes it as the place where the king's prisoners were confined, a royal prison, attached to the administrative apparatus of Pharaoh's government, housing individuals whose cases were of sufficient political sensitivity that they required confinement at the royal level rather than in ordinary criminal custody. Genesis 39 verse 20, this detail matters. Because it means that the men Joseph encountered in that prison were not common criminals. They were people connected to the highest levels of Egyptian power. And two of them, placed in that prison at a specific moment in the unfolding of Joseph's story, were about to become the next link in the chain of divine providence that was moving Joseph, step by inexorable step, toward the destiny that his dreams had announced and his suffering had seemed to make permanently impossible. Some time after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. Genesis 40 verses 1 to 3, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. In the ancient Egyptian court, these were not minor domestic servants. The chief cupbearer, the official responsible for the Pharaoh's wine, who tasted every cup before it reached the royal lips to guard against poisoning, held a position of enormous personal intimacy with the king. The proximity required by the role, the daily personal access to the most powerful man in the ancient world, made the cupbearer one of the most politically significant figures in the entire royal court. And the chief baker, responsible for the Pharaoh's food, occupied a similarly intimate and sensitive position. Both had committed some unspecified offense against Pharaoh. The nature of their crime is not recorded in Scripture, and both had been placed in the royal prison. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. Genesis 40 verse 4, he attended them. Joseph, whose position in the prison had elevated him to a role of oversight and management, was assigned the care of these two high-ranking Egyptian officials. Day after day he served them. Day after day he was present with them in the confined space of their imprisonment. And then one night, both of them, the cupbearer and the baker, dreamed a dream, each his own dream, each dream with its own interpretation. Genesis 40 verse 5. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" Genesis 40 verses 6 to 7, "Why are your faces downcast today?" The attentiveness of that question, the simple human observation that the men in his care were distressed, and the willingness to ask about it rather than simply continue with the practical tasks of the morning, reveals something essential about Joseph's character that the years of suffering had not eroded. He was still present to other people. Still attentive to their inner states. Still willing to step into someone else's distress rather than remaining behind the wall of his own considerable suffering. A man whose heart had turned inward under the weight of injustice would not have noticed the downcast faces. Would not have asked. Would have been too consumed by his own legitimate grief to have space for someone else's. They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." Genesis 40 verse 8, "Do not interpretations belong to God?" In that single question, Joseph communicated everything about the theological framework within which he understood his own gift. He was not presenting himself as a professional dream interpreter. Egypt had those, a sophisticated class of wise men and diviners whose function in the royal court included exactly this kind of work. Joseph was saying something different. He was saying that the meaning of dreams was not a human possession, not a professional skill to be deployed for personal advantage, but a divine gift to be received and shared in dependence on God. The interpretations come from God. I am not the source. God is. Tell me the dreams, and God will provide the meaning. The chief cupbearer told his dream first. In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Genesis 40 verses 9 to 11, the dream was vivid, detailed, symbolic in the way that significant dreams in the biblical narrative are always symbolic, not random images of the sleeping mind but structured communications carrying encoded meaning. And Joseph interpreted it without hesitation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly, when you were his cupbearer. Genesis 40 verses 12 to 13. Restoration. Within 3 days. The interpretation was specific and it was positive and it was delivered with the quiet confidence of a man who was not guessing but receiving. And then Joseph did something that reveals the full humanity of his situation, the real, present, unresolved pain of a man who had been in prison for years on a false charge and who saw in the cupbearer's imminent restoration a possible avenue of his own relief. Only remember me, when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this place. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit. Genesis 40 verses 14 to 15. I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews. Joseph named the injustice clearly and without self-pity but with the honest directness of a man who knew what had been done to him and who was now asking for a legitimate act of advocacy in return for a genuine act of service. He did not pretend to be unbothered by his imprisonment. He did not perform a spiritual contentment that denied the reality of his suffering. He was in a pit, again, the same word used for the cistern his brothers had thrown him into, Genesis 40 verse 15, that he did not deserve to be in. And he was asking the cupbearer to remember him when he was restored to the position that the dream had promised. The chief baker heard the positive interpretation and was encouraged enough to share his own dream. I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. Genesis 40 verses 16 to 17, the dream had the same structural element, 3 of something, a time period, but the content was fundamentally different. The birds eating the food. Not the food being delivered to Pharaoh but consumed by birds before it reached him. And Joseph's interpretation carried none of the consolation of the cupbearers. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head, from you, and hang you on a tree. And the birds will eat the flesh from you. Genesis 40 verses 18 to 19. From you. The terrible precision of that phrase, the head lifted not in honor and restoration but in the specific and final manner of execution. Joseph did not soften it. He did not find a way to deliver a more comfortable interpretation than the dream warranted. He told the truth. The truth was devastating. But it was the truth. And the truth, however painful, was more honoring of the baker's human dignity than a comforting lie would have been. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Genesis 40 verses 20 to 22, exactly as Joseph had said. 3 days. 1 restored to his position. 1 executed. The accuracy of the interpretations was total and immediate and publicly verifiable. Anyone who had heard Joseph's words and then watched what happened on Pharaoh's birthday would have known that something extraordinary had occurred, that the Hebrew slave in the royal prison had been given knowledge that no ordinary human being could possess. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Genesis 40 verse 23, forgot him. 2 years would pass. 730 days of Joseph in the prison, waiting for the memory of the cupbearer to be activated, for the promise of advocacy before Pharaoh to be fulfilled. 2 full years of silence and waiting and the apparent complete failure of the one human connection that had seemed to offer a way out. The man who had been restored to Pharaoh's presence, who every single day placed the cup in the most powerful hand in the ancient world, did not remember the Hebrew in the prison who had told him what his dream meant. He forgot him. And God did not forget him. 2 full years passed. And then Pharaoh dreamed. The king of Egypt, the most powerful man in the ancient world, a figure regarded by Egyptian religious and political tradition as divine, as the son of the sun god Ra, as the embodiment of cosmic order in the human realm, dreamed 2 dreams in a single night that disturbed him so profoundly that by morning his spirit was troubled and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Genesis 41 verses 1 to 8. None who could interpret them. The entire sophisticated intellectual and religious apparatus of the greatest civilization in the ancient world, the professional dream interpreters, the wise men, the magicians, the scholars trained in the ancient traditions of Egyptian wisdom, stood before Pharaoh and had nothing to offer. The dreams had come from a source that Egyptian wisdom had no access to. The meaning encoded in them was beyond the reach of every interpretive tradition that Egypt possessed. And the king who was theoretically divine, who was understood by his own culture to be the mediator between the cosmic order and the human world, could not understand the communication that had come to him in the night. Then the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my offenses today. Genesis 41 verse 9, 2 years late. Prompted not by gratitude or loyalty or the conscience of a man who had promised to remember and had not, but by the crisis of Pharaoh's undecipherable dreams. The cupbearer's memory was activated not by the thought of Joseph but by the failure of everyone else. When the wise men of Egypt could not interpret the dreams, when the professional interpreters stood before Pharaoh in collective silence, when the crisis was real and the resources of Egyptian wisdom were exhausted, then the cupbearer remembered. There is a young Hebrew man there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Genesis 41 verses 12 to 13. A young Hebrew man. In the prison. The most powerful man in the world was about to send for a Hebrew slave in a prison cell. And that Hebrew slave, who had been sold by his brothers, falsely accused by his master's wife, imprisoned for years, forgotten by the man he had served, was about to walk out of the prison and into the presence of Pharaoh. Not because of his own effort. Not because of the cupbearer's loyalty. Not because of any human plan or human advocacy that had worked as intended. But because 2 years earlier God had given 2 men in a prison cell 2 dreams. And God had given Joseph the interpretation of those dreams. And God had been waiting, with the unhurried patience of a sovereign who is never surprised and never behind schedule, for exactly this moment. The moment when Pharaoh's own dreams would create the crisis that would make a Hebrew prisoner from Canaan the only person in Egypt who could help. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. Genesis 41 verse 14, out of the pit. The same word again. From pit to palace. From the cistern in Canaan to the prison in Egypt to the throne room of the most powerful man in the ancient world. And Joseph stood before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Genesis 41 verses 15 to 16, it is not in me. The same theological grounding that Joseph had offered to the cupbearer 2 years earlier. Not my skill. Not my knowledge. Not my professional expertise. God. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Standing before the most powerful man in the world, a man who was theoretically divine, a man in whose presence ordinary protocol required elaborate deference, Joseph's first words were a clear and unambiguous reference to a God other than any that Egypt worshipped. It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. The faithfulness that had characterized Joseph in Potiphar's house and in the prison did not waver in the throne room of Pharaoh. He was the same man. In every context. Under every pressure. Before every audience. And Pharaoh told Joseph his dreams. 7 fat and beautiful cows coming up from the Nile, followed by 7 thin and ugly cows that devoured the 7 fat cows. Genesis 41 verses 17 to 21, and 7 full and good ears of grain, followed by 7 thin ears blighted by the east wind that swallowed up the 7 good ears. Genesis 41 verses 22 to 24, 2 dreams. The same message encoded twice, because, as Joseph would explain, the doubling was the divine signature of certainty. The thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. Genesis 41 verse 32. And Joseph interpreted. The 7 good cows and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The 7 lean and ugly cows and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land. Genesis 41 verses 26 to 30, 7 years of abundance. 7 years of famine so severe that the abundance would be completely forgotten. The interpretation was specific, comprehensive, and practical in its implications, because an interpreted dream without a plan of response was only half of what Pharaoh needed. And Joseph provided the other half. Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. Genesis 41 verses 33 to 36. A practical, detailed, administratively sophisticated plan for national food security. Delivered by a Hebrew slave who had spent the last several years in a prison cell. Delivered with the calm authority of a man who was not merely transmitting a divine message but thinking clearly about its practical implications and offering solutions rather than merely problems. The wisdom that God had placed in Joseph was not merely interpretive. It was executive. It was the wisdom of a man made for governance, made to see problems whole and respond to them with organized, practical, implementable solutions. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God?" Genesis 41 verses 37 to 38, the Spirit of God. The most powerful man in the ancient world, the man whose own culture regarded him as divine, recognized in the Hebrew slave before him the presence of a God whose spirit produced something that no Egyptian training or Egyptian wisdom or Egyptian tradition had been able to produce that morning. Can we find a man like this? The question was rhetorical. They could not. They had tried. Every wise man and magician in Egypt had stood before Pharaoh and offered nothing. And now this young Hebrew, fresh from a prison cell, had not only interpreted the dreams but had outlined a national policy response with the clarity and practicality of a seasoned administrator. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." Genesis 41 verses 39 to 40, over his house. Over all his people. Second only to Pharaoh himself. The elevation was total and immediate and publicly enacted with all the ceremony that Egyptian royal protocol could bring to bear. And Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot. And they called out before him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Genesis 41 verses 41 to 43. Bow the knee. The command that went before Joseph's chariot through the streets of Egypt was the same posture that he had seen in his dreams, the sheaves bowing, the stars bowing, the figures in his dreams prostrating themselves before him. The dreams that his brothers had mocked, the visions that had contributed to their hatred, the divine communications that had seemed so impossibly arrogant in the mouth of a 17-year-old shepherd boy in Canaan, those dreams were becoming real. Not in the way that human ambition would have produced them. Not through Joseph's own striving or self-promotion or political maneuvering. Through the sovereign providence of a God who had been working through every pit and every prison and every year of waiting and every act of injustice to bring his servant to exactly this moment. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh king of Egypt. Genesis 41 verse 46, 30 years old. 13 years since his brothers had stripped the coat from his back and thrown him into the cistern and sold him to the Ishmaelites. 13 years of slavery and false accusation and prison and forgotten promises. 13 years of the kind of suffering that would have justified bitterness and the kind of injustice that would have warranted despair. And at the end of those 13 years, not a moment before and not a moment after, exactly when God had determined, Joseph rode through the streets of Egypt in Pharaoh's second chariot with the signet ring on his finger and the gold chain around his neck and the command "bow the knee" going before him. God's timing is never early and never late. It is always exactly what the story requires. And the story was not finished yet. The 7 years of abundance came exactly as Joseph had said they would. The land of Egypt produced plentifully, more than plentifully, with the extraordinary agricultural generosity of a Nile valley operating at the peak of its fertility, the fields yielding harvests so vast that the grain was like the sand of the sea, beyond measure. Genesis 41 verse 49, and Joseph was there. Overseeing. Organizing. Implementing with precise administrative competence the plan he had laid before Pharaoh in the throne room, going through all the land of Egypt during the 7 years of plenty and gathering up all the food produced in those years, storing food in the cities, laying up in every city the food from the fields around it, collecting grain in quantities so enormous that he eventually stopped keeping records because the amount exceeded the capacity of any accounting system available. Genesis 41 verses 47 to 49. This was Joseph in his element. Not the element of suffering, which he had navigated with extraordinary faithfulness for 13 years. But the element for which all those years of suffering had been, without his knowing it, without his being able to see the purpose in it at the time, preparing him. The administrative experience of Potiphar's house had given him the practical skills of household management and resource organization at a large scale. The years of prison oversight had given him experience managing complex human situations under conditions of constraint and limited resource. The suffering itself had given him something that no administrative training could produce, the character of a man who had been tested at every level of human experience and had not broken, had not turned bitter, had not abandoned the integrity that was the foundation of everything God was doing through him. And now all of it, every experience, every skill, every year of development in the most unlikely classrooms, was being deployed in service of a task that would determine whether an entire civilization survived the coming famine. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Genesis 41 verse 50, Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar priest of On, whom Pharaoh had given him as his wife, bore him these sons. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. Genesis 41 verse 51, made me forget. The name Manasseh, related to the Hebrew word for forget, was not a declaration that Joseph had literally ceased to remember his father and his brothers. It was a declaration of healing. A testimony that the wound had been addressed, that the grief had been met by divine grace, that the hardship of 13 years of slavery and prison and injustice had not defined him in the end but had been transformed by God into something he could name with gratitude rather than bitterness. God has made me forget all my hardship. Not by taking the memory away, but by giving him so much blessing, so much purpose, so much evidence of divine faithfulness that the hardship could be held in perspective, seen for what it was, honored in its reality, but no longer overwhelming everything else. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Genesis 41 verse 52, the land of my affliction. Egypt was still, in Joseph's naming of his son, identified as the land of his affliction. He had not rewritten his own history to make it more comfortable. He had not retrospectively made Egypt something it had not been for most of the years he had spent there. It was the land of his affliction. And in that land, God had made him fruitful. Both things were true simultaneously. The affliction was real. The fruitfulness was real. The land that had been the site of his slavery and his false imprisonment and his years of forgotten waiting was also the land where God had elevated him and given him a family and made him fruitful beyond anything the boy from Canaan could have imagined. Both true. Both held. Both named in the sons whose very existence was living testimony to the God who had been present through all of it. The 7 years of plenty ended. And the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. Genesis 41 verse 54, all lands. The famine was not confined to Egypt or to the Nile Valley. It was a regional catastrophe of the kind that the ancient Near East was periodically subject to, a failure of the rains and the agricultural systems across a wide geographic area that left populations across multiple nations without adequate food. In all the surrounding nations, the crisis was unmanaged and devastating. In Egypt alone, there was bread. Because one man had interpreted 2 dreams and proposed a plan and spent 7 years implementing it with the competence and the integrity that 13 years of suffering had developed in him. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do." Genesis 41 verse 55, go to Joseph. The words of Pharaoh to his own people in a national crisis. The same words, in a different register and a different context, that would one day echo in a greater story, but here, in the immediate historical reality of the famine in Egypt, they were simply the most practical instruction available. Joseph had the grain. Joseph had managed its storage. Joseph had the authority and the administrative structure to distribute it. Go to Joseph. And the famine spread over all the face of the earth. And Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. Genesis 41 verses 56 to 57, all the earth came to Egypt. All the earth came to Joseph. The boy whose brothers had thrown him into a pit and sold him to traders heading to Egypt was now the man to whom all the earth came for bread. The dreamer whose dreams of sheaves bowing had enraged his brothers was now the man before whom the representatives of nations came and bowed to purchase grain. The sovereignty of God working through the worst things human beings had done to Joseph had produced a result so extraordinary, so comprehensive, so far beyond anything that human ambition could have planned or human effort could have achieved, that it could only be understood as what it was, the purposeful, patient, sovereign act of a God who had never for a single moment lost control of Joseph's story. When Jacob saw that there was grain for sale in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" And he said, "Behold, I have heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die." Genesis 42 verses 1 to 2, Jacob. Still alive. Still in Canaan. Still mourning the son he believed had been torn apart by a wild animal 22 years ago. The same famine that was driving the nations to Egypt for food was pressing on the household of Jacob in Canaan. And the same Jacob who had sent Joseph on the errand that had ended in the pit now sent his sons on an errand that would, without their knowing it, bring them face to face with the brother they had sold. So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with his brothers, for he feared that harm might happen to him. Genesis 42 verses 3 to 4, 10 brothers. Benjamin, the youngest, the other son of Rachel, the only remaining child of the woman Jacob had loved most completely, was kept home. Jacob had already lost one son of Rachel. He would not risk losing the other. The fear that had settled over Jacob after the blood-stained coat had never fully lifted. It had simply transferred itself from Joseph to Benjamin, the surviving beloved son, held close, protected from the same world that had apparently devoured his brother. The 10 brothers came and bowed themselves before Joseph with their faces to the ground. Genesis 42 verse 6, and Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he made himself unrecognized to them and spoke roughly to them. "Where do you come from?" he said. They said, "From the land of Canaan, to buy food." Genesis 42 verse 7, he recognized them. They did not recognize him. 22 years had passed. Joseph had been 17 when they last saw him, a boy, in his father's coat, on an errand in Dothan. Now he was 39, dressed in Egyptian fine linen with a gold chain around his neck, speaking Egyptian, the second most powerful man in the ancient world. They bowed before him without the slightest recognition. And Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them. Genesis 42 verse 9. He remembered the dreams. In this extraordinary moment, his brothers prostrate before him, the sheaves bowing that he had dreamed of as a boy, the 22 years of suffering between the dream and its fulfillment compressed into the space of a breath. Joseph remembered the dreams. Not with vindictive triumph. Not with the cold satisfaction of a man who had nursed his grievances across 2 decades and was now in a position to extract payment for them. He remembered the dreams with the recognition of a man who had always known, in some deep and unshakable part of himself, that what God had shown him was true, and was now watching it become true before his eyes in a way that only God could have orchestrated. He spoke roughly to them. He accused them of being spies. Genesis 42 verse 9, he put them in custody for 3 days. Genesis 42 verse 17, he required that one brother remain behind as a pledge while the others returned to Canaan to bring Benjamin. He was not being cruel for the sake of cruelty. He was doing something far more purposeful. He was creating the conditions under which the truth of what his brothers had done, and the truth of what had happened to them since, could be fully surfaced. He was constructing a process of revelation and testing that would, over the coming weeks and months, bring the entire family to the place where genuine reconciliation, not the false reconciliation of ignored guilt but the real reconciliation of acknowledged wrong and offered forgiveness, could become possible. Then they said to one another, "In truth we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul, when he begged us and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us." Genesis 42 verse 21, they did not know Joseph could understand them. They thought they were speaking privately among themselves, in their own language, with the Egyptian official standing nearby unable to comprehend what they said. And what they said, the words that came out of them in the moment of distress and fear, the words that the pressure of the situation extracted from their hearts, was a confession. Not yet to Joseph. Not yet to their father. Not yet to God. But to each other, in the privacy of what they believed was an unheard conversation. "We are guilty concerning our brother. We saw the distress of his soul. He begged us. We did not listen." 22 years of silence broken in a moment of fear before an Egyptian official who was demanding a price from them that they could not fully understand. The guilt had never gone away. It had been carried, unspoken, unaddressed, through all the years of their return to their father and their daily life in Canaan. They had watched Jacob mourn for a son they knew was not dead but could not say so without confessing what they had done. They had lived with the weight of that knowledge and that silence for more than 2 decades. And now, in a foreign country, before a foreign official who was speaking roughly to them and accusing them of espionage, the guilt surfaced in the only form it knew how to take at this stage, acknowledgement to each other, not yet reconciliation with the one they had wronged. And Reuben answered them, "Did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood." Genesis 42 verse 22, a reckoning for his blood. Reuben, who had tried to save Joseph and had come back to the pit to find him gone, was naming what 22 years of silence had not been able to say out loud in the presence of their father. A reckoning. The word implies accountability, consequence, the inevitable arrival of a justice that has been postponed but not cancelled. They were experiencing that reckoning now, not understanding that the instrument of it was standing before them, that the Egyptian official whose rough words had cracked the seal on their buried guilt was the very brother whose blood they had spoken of. Joseph turned away from them and wept. Genesis 42 verse 24, he turned away and wept. The hard exterior he had maintained, the rough speech, the accusation of espionage, the imprisonment, cracked in private as he heard his brother's confession in the language of their shared childhood. He wept. Not with bitterness. Not with anger. With the profound emotion of a man whose long journey was arriving at a destination he had not known how to imagine, whose brothers, who had thrown him in a pit and sold him for silver, were standing before him 22 years later acknowledging their guilt, and whose own heart, after everything, was not closed against them. He returned to them and spoke to them. And he took from them Simeon and bound him before their eyes. Genesis 42 verse 24, Simeon was kept. The others were sent back to Canaan with their sacks filled with grain, their money secretly returned to them in their sacks, and a requirement hanging over them that they must return with their youngest brother Benjamin if they wanted to see Simeon again and buy more grain in Egypt. The road back to Canaan was heavy with dread. When one of them opened his sack and saw his money in the mouth of his sack, their hearts failed them, and they turned trembling to one another, saying, "What is this that God has done to us?" Genesis 42 verse 28, what is this that God has done to us? The brothers who had once conspired against a dreamer were now asking what God was doing in their midst. The theological question that they had never needed to ask during the years of successful concealment was now being forced upon them by the pressure of circumstances they could not control. God was doing something. They could feel it. They did not know what. But the God they had largely ignored in the practical business of their lives was becoming unavoidably present in the crisis of the Egyptian experience. When they came to Jacob their father in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them. And when they emptied their sacks, behold, every man's bundle of money was in his sack. And when they and their father saw their bundles of money, they were afraid. Genesis 42 verses 29 to 35, And Jacob their father said to them, You have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you would take Benjamin. All this has come against me. Genesis 42 verse 36. All this has come against me. The grief of Jacob, accumulated across 22 years of mourning for Joseph, now enlarged by the loss of Simeon and the threatened loss of Benjamin, expressed itself in those words with the exhausted bitterness of a man who had carried too much loss for too long. He did not know, could not know, that Joseph was alive. That Simeon would be returned. That the Egyptian official who was demanding Benjamin's presence was the son he had wept for every day of those 22 years. That what felt like everything coming against him was actually everything being moved, by the patient and sovereign hand of God, toward the most extraordinary family reunion in the history of the biblical narrative. The famine continued to press. The grain brought from Egypt was consumed. And the crisis that Jacob had been trying to avoid, the crisis of Benjamin, arrived with the inevitability of a famine that does not respond to human reluctance. And Judah, the same Judah who had proposed selling Joseph to the Ishmaelites 22 years earlier, stepped forward and offered himself as surety for Benjamin. Genesis 43 verses 8 to 9, I will be a pledge of his safety. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame before you forever. The man who had once profited from his brother's sale was now offering himself in his younger brother's place. Something had changed in Judah across those 22 years. The guilt that had been surfacing since the Egyptian encounter, the weight of what they had done, the long consequences of a single act of cruelty, all of it had been working in Judah's heart. Not yet complete, but moving toward something. And Jacob, the father who had refused to be comforted, who had declared he would go to his grave mourning for Joseph, looked at the famine and the empty stores and the brother in Egypt and the son before him offering to be surety, and made the hardest decision of his long life. Take your brother also, and arise, go again to the man. May God Almighty grant you mercy before the man, and may he send back your other brother and Benjamin. And as for me, if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. Genesis 43 verses 13 to 14. If I am bereaved, I am bereaved. The surrender of a man who has run out of ways to protect what he loves and who places it, finally and completely, in the hands of God Almighty. The God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the God of the covenant, the God who had appeared at Bethel and at the ford of the Jabbok, was being invoked by the old patriarch in the moment of his greatest helplessness. And that God, who had been working in Egypt through a son Jacob thought was dead, was about to answer that invocation in a way that would exceed every hope Jacob had dared to carry through 22 years of grief. The brothers returned to Egypt. 10 of them this time, and Benjamin with them, the youngest, the beloved, the one whose absence from the first journey had been the condition of Simeon's imprisonment and whose presence on this second journey had cost Jacob the most agonizing act of trust he had ever performed. They stood before Joseph again. And when Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the man who was over his house, Bring the men into the house, and slaughter an animal and make ready, for the men are to dine with me at noon. Genesis 43 verse 16. The invitation to dine. In the ancient Near Eastern world, the shared meal carried covenant weight. To eat together was to enter a relationship of peace and mutual obligation, to cross a threshold from the transactional to the personal. Joseph was moving his brothers across that threshold without their understanding why, drawing them into a space of intimacy and generosity while they still did not know who he was. And the men were afraid when they were brought to Joseph's house, and they said, It is because of the money, which was replaced in our sacks the first time, that we are brought in, so that he may assault us and fall upon us to make us servants and seize our donkeys. Genesis 43 verse 18, the fear was real and human and entirely understandable. Men who had done something terrible 22 years ago and who had been living with the awareness of their guilt ever since were now being escorted into the private house of a powerful Egyptian official, and their guilt was supplying reasons for the worst possible interpretation of every development. The steward of Joseph's house reassured them. He brought Simeon out to them. He gave them water to wash their feet. He gave fodder to their donkeys. And when Joseph came home, they brought him the present that they had prepared and bowed down to him to the ground. Genesis 43 verse 26, bowed down to him to the ground. Again. For the second time. The sheaves bowing. The stars bowing. The dreams that had been the source of such hatred, the visions that had contributed to the decision to sell him, being fulfilled in the prostration of 10 brothers before the Egyptian official who was their brother. He asked about their welfare. And he asked about the welfare of their father. Is your father well, the old man of whom you spoke? Is he still alive? Genesis 43 verse 27, still alive. The question carried within it 22 years of separation and longing and the unbearable thought of a father who had been told his son was dead and who had refused to be comforted. Is he still alive? And they said, Your servant our father is well. He is still alive. And they bowed their heads and prostrated themselves. Genesis 43 verse 28. Then he lifted up his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, Is this your youngest brother, of whom you spoke to me? God be gracious to you, my son. And Joseph hurried out, for his compassion grew warm for his brother, and he sought a place to weep. And he entered his chamber and wept there. Genesis 43 verses 29 to 30, he wept. The composed exterior, the authoritative Egyptian official, the powerful administrator of the most significant food distribution operation in the ancient world, all of it dissolved in the private space of his chamber at the sight of Benjamin. His mother's son. The only other child of Rachel. The brother who had been born after Joseph was sold, whom Joseph had never seen grow up, who had been a baby or a small child when Joseph was taken and who was now a grown man standing in Egypt having no idea that the official before whom he bowed was the brother the family had been mourning for over 2 decades. Then he washed his face and came out. And controlling himself, he said, Serve the food. Genesis 43 verse 31, controlling himself. The phrase reveals the effort required to maintain the exterior while the interior was overwhelmed with emotion. Joseph was not indifferent. He was not unmoved. He was deeply, completely moved, and he was not yet ready to reveal himself, not yet, because the revelation required a context and the context was not yet complete. They served him by himself, and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat bread with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. Genesis 43 verse 32, And they sat before him, the firstborn according to his birthright and the youngest according to his youth. And the men looked at one another in amazement. Genesis 43 verse 33, in amazement. The 10 brothers, seated in the order of their birth by an Egyptian official who should have had no way of knowing that order, the coincidence too precise to be coincidence, registering in their awareness as something strange and unexplained that they could not account for. Joseph sent portions to them from before him, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any of theirs. And they drank and were merry with him. Genesis 43 verse 34, 5 times as much. The special portion to Benjamin, visible, deliberate, the same kind of particular favoritism that had once poisoned the air between Joseph and his brothers when their father showed it to Joseph. Joseph was watching. Watching to see what his brothers would do with the favored treatment of the youngest. Watching to see if the jealousy and resentment that had produced his own sale into slavery had been transformed by the years that had passed. They drank and were merry. No resentment visible. No darkening of expressions at Benjamin's larger portion. Something had changed in them. But the test was not yet complete. Joseph commanded the steward of his house, "Fill the men's sacks with food, as much as they can carry, and put each man's money in the mouth of his sack, and put my cup, the silver cup, in the mouth of the sack of the youngest, with his money for the grain." Genesis 44 verses 1 to 2, the silver cup. Joseph's own cup, placed secretly in Benjamin's sack, setting up the final and most revealing test of his brother's character. Because what happened next would answer the question that everything had been building toward. The question that the years of guilt and the Egyptian encounter and the confession to each other and the return with Benjamin had all been moving toward. The question of whether these men were the same men who had thrown a 17-year-old boy into a pit and sat down to eat bread, or whether something had genuinely changed in them. They departed in the morning. They were barely out of the city when Joseph sent his steward after them. "Why have you repaid evil for good? Is it not from this that my lord drinks, and by this that he practices divination? You have done evil in doing this." Genesis 44 verses 4-5, the accusation landed on them like a stone. They were horrified. They protested their innocence with complete sincerity, because they were innocent of this particular charge. The cup had been placed without their knowledge. And the steward searched their sacks, from the oldest to the youngest. And the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. Genesis 44 verse 12. They tore their clothes. Genesis 44 verse 13, the same gesture of grief that their father had made 22 years ago when he received the blood-stained coat. The sons of Jacob, tearing their clothes in anguish, in a foreign land, for a brother unjustly accused. And they loaded their donkeys and returned to the city. And Judah and his brothers came to Joseph's house, and he was still there. They fell before him to the ground. Genesis 44 verse 14, the third time. Bowing. Prostrate. Before the brother they had sold. The sheaves bowing, again. The stars bowing, again. The dreams arriving at their fullest expression in the most painful and most grace-saturated context imaginable. Joseph said, "What deed is this that you have done? Do you not know that a man like me can indeed practice divination?" Genesis 44 verse 15, and Judah answered, "What shall we say to my lord? What shall we speak? Or how can we clear ourselves? God has found out the guilt of your servants. Behold, we are my lord's servants, both we and he also in whose hand the cup has been found." Genesis 44 verse 16, God has found out the guilt of your servants. Judah was not speaking merely about the cup. He could not have been, they were innocent of the cup. He was speaking about something older and deeper and more comprehensive than the silver cup in Benjamin's sack. He was speaking about what they had done 22 years ago. God has found out the guilt of your servants. The confession that had begun in whispers to each other in the Egyptian granary was now being offered publicly and completely before the man who had the power to enslave them all. But Joseph said, "Far be it from me that I should do so. Only the man in whose hand the cup was found shall be my servant. But as for you, go up in peace to your father." Genesis 44 verse 17, go up in peace to your father. Take Benjamin. Leave him here as a slave. The 10 of you, return to Canaan. It was the same dynamic as the original situation, a beloved younger son of Rachel held behind in a foreign land, and 10 brothers with the choice of whether to leave him there or to intervene. Whether to protect themselves or to stand in the place of the vulnerable. And Judah stepped forward. Genesis 44 verse 18, the same Judah who had said, "What profit is it if we kill our brother? Come, let us sell him." That Judah stepped forward and delivered one of the most extraordinary speeches in the entire book of Genesis, a long, detailed, emotionally raw account of everything that had happened, of their father's grief, of the beloved son who was gone, of the father who had said if harm comes to him you will bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to Sheol, of the pledge he had made to his father for Benjamin's safety. Genesis 44 verses 18-34, and then he concluded with words that represent the most complete personal transformation recorded in this narrative, the most decisive evidence that something real had happened in Judah across the years since he had proposed selling his brother. "Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the boy as a servant to my lord, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the evil that would find my father." Genesis 44 verses 33-34. Let your servant remain instead of the boy. Judah, who had once profited from the sale of a brother, was now offering himself as a slave in the place of a brother. The man who had once valued a brother at 20 pieces of silver was now offering his own freedom for the protection of another. The transformation was complete. Real. Costly. Demonstrated not in words of regret but in the willingness to pay the price of genuine substitutionary sacrifice. I will stay. Let Benjamin go. Do to me what you were going to do to him. Take me instead. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Genesis 45 verses 1-2, the composure that had held through the testing and the silver cup and the accusation in Judah's speech, all of it gave way in a single moment. The Egyptian official became a weeping Hebrew brother. The most powerful man in Egypt became the 17-year-old boy his brothers had thrown into a pit. And the sound of his weeping was so intense, so uncontained, so complete that it was heard throughout the palace. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" Genesis 45 verse 3, I am Joseph. 3 words in the Hebrew. 3 words that collapsed 22 years of separation and silence and grief and guilt and suffering into a single moment of revelation so overwhelming that his brothers could not answer him. They were dismayed at his presence. Genesis 45 verse 3, dismayed. The word communicates something stronger than surprise, the terror of men who suddenly understood that the Egyptian official before whom they had bowed was the brother whose face they had last seen as he was being taken away in the hands of slave traders. That the man with the power of life and death over them in Egypt was the boy they had sold. That the 22 years of guilt they had been carrying had just come face to face with its object, and he was alive, and he was here, and he was weeping. "Come near to me, please." And they came near. And he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." Genesis 45 verses 4-5, do not be distressed or angry with yourselves. The most extraordinary act of grace in the entire narrative. The man who had every right, by any human standard, by any measure of justice that could be applied, to be angry, to demand reckoning, to extract from his brothers the full weight of the suffering they had caused, was telling them not to be distressed. Not because what they had done was acceptable. Not because the pain had not been real. But because he could see, from the vantage point of 39 years and 13 years of slavery and prison and the sovereign hand of God visible in the rearview mirror of his life, that God had been working through all of it. For God sent me before you to preserve life. God sent me. Not, you sold me and God worked around it. Not, you did evil and somehow God salvaged something from the wreckage. God sent me. The theological statement was breathtaking in its scope and its generosity. Joseph was not denying the reality of what his brothers had done. He was placing it within a larger frame, the frame of divine sovereignty that had been working through the worst human actions to accomplish purposes that no human being had conceived or planned. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Genesis 45 verse 8. Not you who sent me here, but God. The sovereignty of God over human evil, not excusing it, not minimizing it, not pretending it did not happen, but insisting that it did not have the final word. That the pit was not the end. That the slave market was not the end. That the prison was not the end. That the forgotten promise of the cupbearer was not the end. That God had been present in every darkness, working in every injustice, moving through every year of suffering toward a purpose that the suffering itself could not prevent and that only the sovereign God who had given the dreams in the first place could have accomplished. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, "Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me." Genesis 45 verses 9-10, come down to me. The invitation extended to a father who had mourned his son as dead for 22 years. Come down to me. The father who had refused to be comforted, who had declared he would go to his grave in mourning, was about to receive the most impossible news of his long life. Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. After that his brothers talked with him. Genesis 45 verses 14 to 15, he kissed all his brothers. All of them. The ones who had stood around the pit. The ones who had sat down to eat bread. The ones who had dipped his coat in blood and carried it to his father. He kissed them all. And wept upon them. The reconciliation was not managed or cautious or partial. It was complete and physical and overwhelmingly emotional and utterly genuine. Because Joseph had understood something about his own story that made forgiveness not merely possible but necessary, that the God who had been sovereign over his suffering had also been working in the hearts of his brothers, and that the brothers who stood before him weeping were not the same men who had stood around the pit 22 years ago. They had been changed. By guilt and by grace and by the long consequence of what they had done and by the pressure of the Egyptian encounters that had surfaced what had been buried. They were different. And Joseph received them as the men they had become. When the news reached Pharaoh's house that Joseph's brothers had come, it pleased Pharaoh and his servants. Genesis 45 verse 16, Pharaoh himself entered the story of Israel's family reunion, commanding that wagons be sent to bring Jacob and all his household down to Egypt, promising the best of the land of Egypt, instructing them not to be concerned about their goods for the best of all the land of Egypt was theirs. Genesis 45 verses 17 to 20, the blessing that had rested on Joseph, the favor that had followed him from Potiphar's house to the prison to the throne room, now extended outward to encompass his entire family. So they went up out of Egypt and came to the land of Canaan to their father Jacob. And they told him, Joseph is still alive, and he is ruler over all the land of Egypt. And his heart became numb, for he did not believe them. But when they told him all the words of Joseph which he had said to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. And Israel said, It is enough. Joseph my son is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. Genesis 45 verses 25 to 28. It is enough. 3 words from the mouth of a father who had mourned for 22 years. Who had refused comfort. Who had declared he would go to his grave in grief. It is enough. Joseph is alive. The grief that had defined 2 decades of Jacob's life was being dissolved in a single moment of impossible, overwhelming, grace-saturated news. Joseph my son is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. And Israel set out with all that he had and came to Beersheba, where he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again. Genesis 46 verses 1 to 4, I myself will go down with you to Egypt. The same God who had been with Joseph in the pit, in Potiphar's house, in the prison, in the throne room, the same God who had been present through every darkness and every injustice and every year of waiting, was now declaring his presence to the Father as he made the journey that would bring the family together. I will go down with you. And I will also bring you up again. The promise looked forward, past the reunion, past the years in Goshen, past the death of Jacob and the death of Joseph and the 400 years of slavery that were coming that no one yet knew about, to the bringing up again. To the Exodus. To the generation of Moses. To the moment when the descendants of the 12 sons of Jacob would be brought up out of Egypt in the most dramatic act of national redemption in the history of the ancient world. The story of Joseph was not an isolated narrative. It was a chapter in a much longer story, the story of a family becoming a nation, of 12 brothers becoming 12 tribes, of the covenant promises made to Abraham finding their way through every human failure and every divine faithfulness toward their ultimate fulfillment. And Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to meet Israel his father in Goshen. He presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. Israel said to Joseph, Now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you are still alive. Genesis 46 verses 29 to 30, now let me die. Not with despair but with completion. The grief that had refused comfort had been answered. The father who had mourned a son as dead had seen his face. The wound that had defined 22 years of Jacob's life had been healed, not by the undoing of what had been done, but by the sovereign mercy of a God who had been working through every moment of that wound toward this moment of reunion. Now let me die. I have seen your face. It is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. And the time drew near that Israel must die. Genesis 47 verses 28 to 29, Jacob died in Egypt. He was embalmed and carried back to Canaan, to the cave of Machpelah where Abraham and Isaac and their wives were buried. Genesis 50 verse 13, he went home. The patriarch of the covenant, the man whose name God had changed to Israel, was buried in the promised land, the land that his descendants would one day inherit in the fulfillment of every promise that had been spoken over Abraham beside a fire at night when the stars were too many to count. And when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." Genesis 50 verse 15, the fear that had been dormant through the years in Egypt, suppressed perhaps by Jacob's presence, by the implicit protection of a father whom Joseph so clearly loved, surfaced in the moment of Jacob's death. They sent a message to Joseph. "Your father gave this command before he died, say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you." Genesis 50 verses 16 to 17, please forgive. The formal request for forgiveness, the acknowledgement of the transgression named clearly as sin, as evil, offered to the brother who had never stopped being their brother. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Genesis 50 verse 17, he wept. Not with anger. Not with the vindication of a man who had been waiting for this moment of their vulnerability. With the same overwhelming emotion that had characterized every significant moment of his reunion with his family. He wept because the fear in their words revealed how completely they had misunderstood him. How little they knew of the grace that had been working in his heart across all the years of suffering. "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." Genesis 50 verses 19 to 21. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. The theological summit of Joseph's entire story. The sentence that contains within it the entire sweep of what the narrative has been demonstrating across 13 chapters of Genesis. Not, God prevented the evil. Not, God worked around the evil. God meant it for good. The same events, viewed from two different perspectives. From the brother's perspective, evil. Intended and executed evil. The deliberate decision to throw a brother in a pit and sell him for silver. Evil. And God did not pretend otherwise. He did not reframe it as something other than what it was. He called it what it was, evil, and then said something that could only be said from the vantage point of divine sovereignty over all human action. He meant it for good. The God who does not cause evil but who's sovereign over all things, including evil, was working through the worst things Joseph's brothers had done to accomplish purposes that exceeded anything they could have imagined when they sat down to eat bread beside the pit. The preservation of life. The survival of the covenant family through a 7-year famine. The positioning of Israel's family in Egypt, exactly where they needed to be for the next chapter of the covenant story to unfold, the chapter of slavery and exodus and the giving of the law at Sinai and the formation of a nation. All of it, set in motion by a coat, and a pit, and 20 pieces of silver, and the sovereign hand of a God who was never surprised and never defeated and never absent. Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the 3rd generation. The children also of Machir the son of Manasseh were counted as Joseph's own. Genesis 50 verses 22 to 23, he lived to see his grandchildren's grandchildren. The man who had been sold as a slave at 17 lived to see the third generation of his descendants. The dreamer outlived the pit and the prison and the false accusation and the forgotten promise and the famine and the family reunion and the grief of his father's death, and lived long enough to see the covenant family multiplying and flourishing and filling the land of Goshen with the beginning of what would one day become the 12 tribes of Israel. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Genesis 50 verse 24, God will visit you. The dying man's final words were not about himself. Were not a review of his own extraordinary story. Were not a final accounting of what he had suffered and what he had achieved. They were a forward-pointing, covenant-grounded, prophetic declaration about what God was going to do next. God will visit you. The promise made to Abraham, the promise of the land, the promise of nationhood, the promise of divine presence and divine redemption, was still in force. Still moving forward. Still heading toward its fulfillment. And Joseph, who had seen more of the sovereign faithfulness of God than almost any other human being in the biblical record, was absolutely certain that it would be kept. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. Genesis 50 verse 25, carry up my bones. His final request was a declaration of faith, a physical, practical, embodied expression of his certainty that God would keep the promise, that the descendants of Israel would leave Egypt, that the land of Canaan would one day receive them and receive him. He wanted his bones to make the journey. He wanted the physical remnant of his life to travel with the covenant family from Egypt to the promised land, connecting the story of his extraordinary life to the larger story of which it had always been a part. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Genesis 50 verse 26, in a coffin in Egypt. Waiting. As the covenant was waiting. As the promises to Abraham were waiting. As the descendants of the 12 sons of Jacob were about to wait through 400 years of slavery for the God who had visited Joseph to visit them, in fire and cloud and plague and parted sea and the voice of thunder at Sinai. And centuries later, when Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt, Scripture records a detail that would be easy to overlook in the drama of the Exodus but that carries within it the full weight of everything Joseph had trusted and hoped and declared. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here. Exodus 13 verse 19, the bones made the journey. The coffin that had waited in Egypt through 400 years of slavery traveled with the liberated nation through the wilderness and across the Jordan and into the promised land. Joseph had been right. God had visited them. The promise had been kept. The bones came home. The boy in the coat of many colors, sold by his brothers for 20 pieces of silver, carried to Egypt in a slave caravan, falsely accused, imprisoned, forgotten, had become the man who saved the ancient world from famine, who reconciled a broken family, who declared the sovereignty of God over human evil in words that have echoed across 3,000 years of human history and have not yet finished echoing. You meant it for evil. But God meant it for good. That declaration, that breathtaking, theologically profound, personally costly, genuinely believed declaration from a man who had paid the full price of its truth in his own flesh and his own years, is the beating heart of Joseph's story. And it is the beating heart of something far larger than Joseph's story. Because the God who meant it for good in Joseph's life is the same God who, in the fullness of time, would allow the worst thing human beings had ever done, the rejection and crucifixion of his own son, to become the means of the greatest good the world has ever known. The cross that looked like defeat. The tomb that looked like the end. The 3 days of silence that looked like the death of every promise. Meant for evil by the hands that nailed him there. Meant for good by the God who raised him from the dead and through that resurrection offered to every human being who has ever been in a pit, through betrayal, through injustice, through suffering, through the long silence of years that seem to have no purpose, the same word that Joseph spoke to his brothers in Egypt. Do not be afraid. God meant it for good.